Hi, everybody. Josh's practice. Josh's kids had probably taught him, actually. They come over to our house. That's always the starting gun. Hey, everybody. Hey, Dan. And then we go. That's great. I'm glad you're here. Tonight we're going to be in Proverbs again. We're going to be picking up near the end of chapter 2, which is where we left off last week. And so if you're just joining us, you can open a Bible to Proverbs chapter 2. We're going to try to cover the end of chapter 2, some important ideas in 3, 4, and 5 tonight. So that's the plan. Let me start off with this. Those of you, especially that have been here for these classes and that have been reading from these wisdom books in preparation for these classes, between the two books that I think you can properly call wisdom books, the two that we studied that are written by Solomon, let's say it that way, which is Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, which do you find the easier to read? Raise your hand if you're a bigger fan of Ecclesiastes. You're like, that one speaks to me. I find it an easier read. That one's a big deal. Okay, raise your hand for Ecclesiastes.
I like that, but I don't think it's easier to read.
Oh, okay. But you like it better. Oh, okay. All right. So let's just clarify the question. Raise your hand if you like Ecclesiastes better than Proverbs. Okay. And then flip it. Raise your hand if you like Proverbs better than Ecclesiastes. Yeah. Okay. Good. I get that because to me they are very, very different. And the differences between the two is just kind of something I wanted to highlight. I wanted to show to get us started for tonight because I really dug into the Ecclesiastes thing, just personally. That was the one that to me was the more engaging of the two so far in this process. But I'm also really enjoying figuring out how to kind of move with the motion of Proverbs as well, how to understand the flow of thought there. So just do this little exercise looking at the two of these because they do seem so different that they hardly feel like they could be doing the same thing. In Ecclesiastes, you get the phrase, or you get a teaching that says to get wisdom is just striving after the wind. It can't be really done. But then in Proverbs, you say you have wisdom personified as a woman crying out and saying, anybody can have wisdom if you just try. You just want it and decide to learn it. I am here to be understood. Okay? So they do seem like they're making opposite points, right? The next verse of Ecclesiastes after that one says that getting wisdom just increases vexation and sorrow. But then you have all these different places in the Proverbs where it says that getting wisdom is the path to peace. And surety, yeah, that's the right word, surety, serenity, okay, things like that. And then in Ecclesiastes, you have the reminder that the wise man dies just like the fool. There's no difference between the two. But in Proverbs, wisdom is talked about as something that will keep the bad things that happen to wicked men from happening to you. So the difference between the two is stark, and so stark that they seem like they're contradictory to each other. I corrected it. Don't laugh too hard. No, I didn't at all. But anyway, I just think that both of them have just some obviously extreme value for us. Let's do a little exercise. How would you characterize the difference between the two sets of wisdom that help them not seem contradictory? Marcus.
Perspective.
Okay.
Different perspectives.
Okay. Yeah. Absolutely. So, I guess clarify. Ecclesiastes is what kind of perspective? Proverbs is what kind of perspective?
Proverbs strikes me as a perspective of someone who's younger potentially.
Okay.
So maybe because Solomon is perceived to be the writer of both.
Okay.
He was younger when he wrote Proverbs, whereas Ecclesiastes you can tell he's an older man.
Okay.
At that point.
Okay.
So I think that's kind of the perspective.
Okay. Yeah. In part. There's pieces of each book that would seem to break that paradigm, but not entirely. And I see what your point is, and I agree with you to some extent. Dad?
Yeah, I think the difference is that in Ecclesiastes, it's Solomon's wisdom.
Okay.
Okay, he's not angry with God. I mean, he'll bring that out, but you get really a writing from Solomon and his perspective and the way he sees wisdom and how it works in our lives or doesn't work in our lives. Whereas Proverbs, again, I think you have, again, maybe it's a different season, maybe there's a different thing going on, but it's God's wisdom.
Okay.
And he's really leaning into this one.
Okay. All right.
That's what I see.
Yeah. All right. I can understand that. Again, a few things in each case that would break that as a pure paradigm, but I understand where you're coming from. No disagreement. All right. Anybody else want to take a stab at it? What is it that helps us to characterize the difference?
I'll throw it out. An idea that I've had and been playing with is Proverbs, more of an earthly wisdom, how to apply to your living.
Okay.
Where Ecclesiastes is more of a heavenly perspective, where you see that there is an end and there's something better at the end of it. And there's a different perspective.
Okay. All right. I'll give you that. Yeah. I see what you're saying in that one as well. Okay. Here's the way that I did it. Whether this is the right way or wrong way or best way, I don't know. But this is the way that I kind of summarized that Ecclesiastes is kind of encouraging us to accept the things that we cannot change. And Proverbs is very strongly encouraging us to accept responsibility for the things that we can change. You see the difference there, and you see how those could apply? Again, there may be a few things in each case that would break some of those paradigms. So Ecclesiastes is going to have some sections of wisdom and go, listen, as long as it's in your power to do this, do it. And Proverbs is going to occasionally say, listen, there are some things that are too wonderful for us to understand. There's just some things that we are not going to be able to wrap our minds around. But by and large, and that's, I think, the best that any of us can do with any of these answers, by and large, I think that helps to kind of understand why they would seem to be contradicting each other, but they're not. They go seamlessly. There are just so many perspectives that even divine wisdom helps us to see, like, that's not the only way that this can go. It is beyond black and white in many cases. Okay, so both of them are true. Both are telling us the truth, and both are helpful for us as we try to walk with God in a faithful way every day. So that's the intro. That's the thought process to kind of get our brains connected to Proverbs again. Marcus is here tonight, and he's going to lead us in a word of prayer, and then we'll dig into where we left off with chapter 2 from last time.
Dear Lord, we just come humbly and thankful for another night to get together and study more in your word. Pray that Dan may be able to get the thoughts that he wants out effectively to us, and that we will be able to take them and apply them to our lives, because we know that it's coming strictly from God, from your word, and that it will only help and amplify our lives. Lord, we thank you again for everyone being able to make it here safely, and may we be able to take these lessons learned into the rest of our week. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, sir. Okay, so we were talking last time about how when you look at Proverbs 2, and this is going to be a thing that shows up quite a bit, but it's basically talking about how there are only two paths that you can choose through this life. Now, again, we're calling the class Beyond Black and White, so we're saying there are more than two paths to be taken in situations. That's true on the micro level. But on the macro level, looking at your life as a whole, there are really only two options. You choose the good, which is wisdom, or you choose the evil, which is foolishness. The two go hand in hand in each case, and the two different paths are clearly delineated and separated from each other throughout so much of the Proverbs. And so, the blessing of knowing wisdom is a contrast again and again and again to the death and the struggle and the turmoil that comes when you follow Lady Folly. Okay, and so when you get to chapter 2, you look at chapter 2, verse 5. Let's take a look at that. I'll take in verse 4 and 5. If you seek wisdom like silver and search for it as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. One commentator that I was reading points out that there are basically the two pillars of Old Testament religious practice are in that verse. Number one, when you approach God, you fear him, which is what we would call awe, A-W-E, a sense of awe at God. And number two, you want to come, even with that sense of awe, you want to come close to God. And so the tabernacle was in the middle of the camp of Israel because God wanted to be close and he wanted them close with him. Then you will know the Lord your God. So there's two pillars right there of Old Testament religion, and it just shows how wise it is to do what's right. Okay. Now we have this section, and this is really this is what I wanted to focus on, finishing up chapter 2. We have this section starting in verse 16 of chapter 2, where he talks about Lady Folly as a seductress or a strange woman is the translation. It's what it says in some of the translations. So can I get a volunteer who is willing to read verses 16 through 19 of chapter 2? Raise a hand, let me know if that's you. Proverbs, chapter 2, 16 through 19. All right, Josh, go for it. Thanks.
So you will be delivered from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words, who forsakes the companion of her youth, and forgets the covenant of her God. For her house sinks down to death, and her paths to the departed. None who go back to her come back, nor do they regain the paths of life.
Okay, so this description of Lady Folly as the seductress, or just talking about like warnings, my son, don't give in to this woman and her wiles, don't give in to the way that she's trying to draw you away from what's wise and what's right and from God himself. Don't give in to that. That's a thing that's going to show up quite a bit. So just tonight, we're going to have the entirety of chapter 5 is devoted to that same idea. And then next Wednesday night, when you get into chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9, most of chapter 7 is devoted to that same idea. The second half of chapter 6 is devoted to that same idea, and it does come up again, I believe, toward the end of chapter 8. So in the first 9 chapters of Proverbs, this idea comes up so many times, okay? And it's just this long reminder, about the importance of keeping ourselves pure and using that as a metaphor to say, keep your life completely devoted to God in wisdom, doing what's right. Interestingly enough, Josh was reading the ESV. Anybody's translation have a different word in verse 16 where it says you will be delivered from the strange woman. Okay, yeah. Bit of an unfortunate English translation. Okay, bless you. But it's worth knowing it's the same word that's used in Leviticus chapter 10 and verse 1, which is the passage where Nadab and Abihu offered strange fire before the Lord. And a lot of times that word is translated what? From Leviticus 10 and 1. Anybody remember? What's that? Foreign or unauthorized. The thing that's not allowed. That's the word that's being used right here to talk about this woman. So if you have wisdom, it will keep you from the woman you're not allowed to have. Okay? Which you can, for a married man, that's any woman other than his wife. For an unmarried man, that's any woman that he's not married to at that point, right? So it's basically this thing, and again, he's using it as a metaphor to remind us that sin and foolishness are trying to trap us. They're trying to draw us away from God, and they're trying to kill us. Yes, ma'am?
Does Lady Folly, is that your translation?
It's not a translation. It's my description. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, because of the way that so often through this, you have wisdom as the woman who is crying out and saying, accept my words, listen to me, come and find me, I'm here for you, I want to teach you the right ways. And you have Lady Folly, is what I'm calling her, is the seductress, right, who's saying, no, come this way. Come off the righteous path and follow me and do what I'm telling you to do. And so I'm just contrasting them, picking up on the things that other commentators have done with the same passages. Okay, then we get to the end of chapter 2. We have this final contrast, at least for this chapter, set up here, verses 20 and 21. So if you do the right things, if you walk in the way of the good and keep to the paths of the righteous, for the upright will inhabit the land, but those with integrity will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be rooted out of it. And so the reminder for us is that there is a way that leads to life and a way that leads to death. Only two paths. There are only two paths. And so the wisdom of following God is going to lead in that way. Okay? And I just want to point this out because maybe it shouldn't have been, but this was a big deal to me, a big realization. When you look through these first 9 chapters, and it's probably going to prove true through the rest of the book. I just haven't gotten there in my studies this time yet. But over and over again, you see an unbreakable connection between wisdom and righteousness. And that's kind of the thing with the Proverbs writer. So like, I think I know why I have this thought, but for whatever reason, for a long time, in my brain, I've had them as 2 different things. And they are 2 different things, but Solomon is using them as extremely connected synonyms. That wisdom, if you do what's wise, you're doing what's right. And if you do what's right, you're doing what's wise. Right? And the same in the inverse. You have that's one path where it's wisdom and righteousness, and the other path is foolishness and sin, foolishness and wickedness. Okay? And so it's important for us to kind of go ahead and acknowledge that because I had this somewhere in my notes, I thought. I guess my question is, everybody always looks at Solomon, understandably, wisest man to ever live. So then the question is, if Solomon is so wise, how does he get entangled in the mess of idolatry and marrying so many women and having a harem with so many women?
He's still a human.
Okay. All right.
And because of that, he's tempted, even though he's the wisest guy around.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Fair enough. My challenge to that as the reason, as the way to understand it, is these passages that are going, listen, don't give in to a woman who's drawing you away. Just don't. It's unwise. It's foolish. Don't be foolish, Solomon.
Have you ever heard somebody make a speech and you know that that person making the speech doesn't believe a word of what he's saying?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I have. And that could be a way of explaining Solomon here as well. Maybe he's just telling us, do as I say, not as I do.
There's some men that have women trouble.
All right.
And this particular Solomon has a bad problem.
Bad case of it, yeah. Some men just have women problems, and this Solomon has a bad case of that. Okay. All right.
I guess I always wondered if he didn't write it because he had that problem.
Okay.
The experience leading to the wisdom.
Maybe it's like an attempt at self-redemption of some sort. Okay. Chloe, what do you think?
I think sometimes wisdom and power can bring a lot of arrogance.
Okay.
And so, we don't know Solomon's mindset when he got into everything, but I think it would be easy to see him thinking, well, I'm the wisest man in the world, surely I'll be able to handle this.
Right. That may be the case as well. So all of those may be the case. Can I show you just a really interesting little nugget about the Bible and its organization that I discovered that helped me to understand this? I just found this today. When you look at all the mentions of Solomon's wisdom, chronologically, every single one of them falls before his sin with the women. There is not a single other mention of his wisdom after he does this thing, after he's talked about doing this thing. I know it was a process. 1,000 women don't come into your life in the same day. I totally get that, okay? But I know it was a process. But just in the organization of the text, his multiple wives and his turning away his heart to follow other gods, not just Yahweh, his God. That happens in 1 Kings 11. And after that in 1 Kings, there's not another mention of how wise Solomon was. I think that says something, doesn't it? And I think what it says is this is still consistent. That wisdom is righteousness. And so when Solomon went off the rails, it was not a wise man going off the rails. It was a man who had been wise, who turned his heart to seek other gods. And when the fear of the Lord disappeared from his life, so did his wisdom. Because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. You see it? That may be worth writing down, by the way, for that just Solomon's wisdom never shows up in the timeline after the women enter his life. Okay, so one more thought on chapter 2, and I'll just throw it up here so that you can fill in the sheet. In terms of wisdom, the last couple verses of chapter 1 just remind us that timing is everything. A person who does the right thing at the wrong time is not being wise. The person who does the right thing at the right time, that's a person that gets it. That's kind of the definition of good practical wisdom. Okay, so let's go on then and move into chapter 3. And in chapter 3, I didn't have a good title for this, so I just called it the most obvious thing that it is, which is Spiritual Lessons from a Father to a Son. Of course, you would have to call it that. It begins with, my son, here are the instructions for life. So, that's what it is. Here's the interesting thing about it, though. Throughout this whole deal, the instructions and the promises are coming as little pairs. And so throughout, the instructions are things like, my son, keep my teachings and my commands. Keep steadfast love and faithfulness. Trust God. Follow his paths. Fear God and turn from evil. And then honor God with the best of your wealth. On the flip side of all of those, he has all these things that he says will happen if you do that. You'll have a long life and live peaceful days. You'll receive favor and success with God and man. Bless you. You'll have straight paths, which is like a Hebrew way of saying you'll have a good life. Okay, it's like a smooth paved road. It's easier to drive that than it is a dirt road. You know, it's all washed out and washboarded. It's that kind of picture here. You'll have bodily healing and refreshment for your soul, and your grain and your wine harvests will be huge. Okay, so all of these are talked about as the blessings through chapter 3 of doing what God has called you to do. And so here it is again, just the same list, all the different things that are promised to those who do what is wise and follow God. And then in the middle of that, kind of dispersed through there, we have a couple of patches of just good advice on making it happen. So can I have a volunteer to read verses 5 through 7? I'm going to assign 3 different sections here, just 2 or 3 verses each. Give me 3 volunteers. Raise some hands. Okay, Nathan's got 5 through 7. Megan's got 9 to 10. And then Jim, you're going to have 11 and 12. Okay, go ahead, Nathan.
Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil.
Okay, so it occurred to me just now hearing Nathan read that out loud. Maybe the way I've chosen to word this summary is not the best here. Follow God, not your heart, unless you're following the first phrase that Nathan just read, which is that your heart is fully belonging to God. And in that case, it works. But you know what I mean by saying it the way I did here, right? Because how many times do we get the advice, well, just follow your heart? No, don't. That's not good advice. Do the right thing. Do the wise thing. Sometimes, if your heart is what it should be, they'll be the same. But if they're not the same, choose God over your own way 100% of the time. That will always work out best. Yes, sir?
The American Standard Translation words that just a little different. Verse 5, trust in Jehovah with all thy heart.
Good.
Lean not upon thine own understanding.
Perfect. And that's really the idea, is because when we say follow your heart, if you say follow anything in that sort of sense of it, that's what we're doing. We're putting our trust in that, whether it's ourselves or something outside of ourselves. And the point there is follow him. Period. Okay. Verses 9 and 10, Megan.
Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will be bursting with wine.
Okay. Now, at the risk of, I put it up on the chart as the side-by-side because that's the way it's right here. It's side-by-side thoughts that if you are kind with your wealth, then God will be kind to give you wealth. Is that the prosperity gospel? No, but it sure would be used. It's sure one of those passages that people would try to use to say the reason you follow God is because it'll be good for you. It will be good for you. That's not the reason. The reason you follow God is because it's the right thing to do, because he is right. And so what he's saying here first is, my son, if you honor God with your wealth and the first fruits of your produce, you will end up being blessed. It's not the reason you do it, but it is a nice outcome, you know. And that's important for us to keep thinking about here. I also put in that phrase about radical generosity because of the use of the word first fruits. Because what does he say to give God? Is it like give him something? It doesn't have to be much, just give him something. No, he says you take the first thing that grows. You take the first thing from this year's crop that's ready to be harvested. That's going to be the best part of the crop. Yes. That's the point. Give him the best of what you have. Be generous, whether you're talking about generous giving, to the temple or the tabernacle, if you're an ancient Israelite, or you're talking about generous giving to the poor and the widow in your towns. The point is, use the best of what you have as a way of serving God. Okay? And then verses 11 and 12. Jim, do you mind reading those?
My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor detest his correction. For whom the Lord loves, he corrects, just as the father and the son whom he delights.
Okay. Now, the Hebrews writer is going to wax eloquent about this concept and talk about, it's a clear demonstration of the fact that God loves you, that he is disciplining you. And that's not a pleasant thing, but you accept it knowing that it's leading somewhere good. Same concept, same idea right here. There are trials, there are things that we go through, and James says when we go through them faithfully, they produce in us steadfastness and hope. Okay, and so we just got to make sure that we kind of lock that idea in from kind of all over the scriptures, that God's discipline for us is a sign of his love. Another piece of advice, this is verses 27 and 28, is when you can do good, do it then. Do not send somebody away empty-handed thinking I'll do good for them later when you have the opportunity to do it right now. It's really good, solid piece of advice. Okay. And then this last one, this is important from chapter 3 as well. Do not envy a man, I'm in verse 31, I'm sorry. Do not envy a man of violence, and do not choose any of his ways, for the devious person is an abomination to the Lord, but the upright are in his confidence. The fact that that says an abomination, that is a strong sounding word, and you're like, oh, I should pay a lot of attention to a strong sounding word like that. Yeah, because a devious person is not in God's favor. That's not a good thing. And so let's just make sure that we don't envy them and wish that we could be like them in some way. Okay. Now, with all those promises outlined and all those, do this and here are the outcomes outlined in chapter 3, I gave you this question on the homework from last time, and I want to talk about it a little bit. If anybody's got anything written down, I'd love to hear it. How do we reconcile the many promises in Proverbs about God's favor toward righteous people with Job's teaching that the universe does not always balance good for good and bad for bad? So, anybody that had an answer written down on the homework, you get first priority. And if everybody sits quietly and you can tell nobody around you had anything written down, then you can go for it. How do we balance these two ideas? Because they're both biblical, but they seem contradictory. How are they not? Marcus?
So it's not contradictory because the good things that we're promised realistically as Christians are after this life.
Okay.
It's not necessarily material things. And that's where the wealth gospel and prosperity gospel comes into play. But those things that we're, and I'm hesitant in saying that just because I don't want to just limit it to just the afterlife, heaven.
Yeah.
But realistically, that's what our focus should be, not necessarily things that are going on here.
Okay.
As far as
okay. All right. I'll take that. So if I can rephrase it the way that just rephrase what he just said, we do well to make sure that those things are not our anchor. Because the anchor for these promises being fulfilled is beyond the end of this life, not in this life. We may get some of these blessings along the way, and they're wonderful when God gives them, but they're not the anchor and they're not the motivation. Okay, all right, I'll take that. All right, anybody else? How do we balance the two? Yes, sir.
Could it be that the promises that we read in the Proverbs fit with the definition of what a proverb is?
Yeah, there's flexibility. They are flexible. Ashley's word from last time was truism.
Yeah.
They are truisms. They're not formulas.
Yeah, they're not laws.
Yeah. Ashley's a lawyer, in case y'all didn't know. Was, okay. But yeah, so they're not codified statements of formulaic behaviors and absolutes. Yeah, exactly. Okay. All right, Mr. Randall, last one here.
A lot of times we hear people and they use this as an excuse for not obedience to God because there's so many promises that he made that he doesn't keep through.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you can explore them with specific examples which they have difficulty with. But this overall statement, it's a true statement about God. Just because you can find one example of where it looks like someone didn't follow through with that does not take away the fact that that is still their character. Example being the night before the crucifixion, Christ is praying, and the answer was, no, this is your purpose.
Right.
But that does not take away God's nature.
Yes.
That by his nature, he does bless us.
Yeah. This is interesting because you can make the same, you can ask the same question toward Ecclesiastes as well. And I think Randall's reflex of pointing us toward the cross is probably the most helpful way to explore this. Because it's not that bad things are always bad. Sometimes they are part of God's grander purpose. Now, sometimes they're just bad. Okay? What Pharaoh did against the children of Israel, against their children, was horrible. A horrible sin. Okay? But even there, God is going to use this horrible thing and turn it around and lead to the release and the building up of his people, And the same is true with the cross. What the chief priests and the scribes and Pharisees did that night was awful. Judas's part in that was truly terrible. And yet, on Sunday, it made sense that God had used it for his good purposes. And so I do think it helps us to understand, like, most of the proverbs, most of the truisms that are found there, they are going to play out. Right? They're going to work out a vast majority of the time. That if you're a good, honest person with good, honest work ethic and business practices, guess what that's going to lead to? Financial stability. The math is there, and overall, the math works out. Now, there are times when something crazy comes out of nowhere and you realize all that wealth was just a vapor, Ecclesiastes. And there are times when God looks at you as a wealthy person and says, you know what? I am going to allow you to be tested and find out what your faith is really made of. We're back to Job now. But all of them come together, as Randall says, in the grand purposes and the grand character of God and who he is. It was a really cool way to think about this, wrapping it all up together. All right, Marcus, last one here.
This is a verse about my head, Romans 8:28.
Yeah.
For those who love God.
All things work together for good. Yeah, absolutely, according to his purpose. All right. Super helpful. Okay, let's move into chapter 4 now. And in setting up chapter 4, I found a helpful little outline of a couple of chapters from Derek Kidner's commentary. He talks about how chapter 2 shows us the moral stability of wisdom. Chapter 3 shows us the serenity and the blessings of wisdom. And chapter 4 now is going to show us the exaltation of wisdom. That you become exalted, and there are really good things that happen when you acquire wisdom and devote yourself to it. So, first thing, what does it take to get wisdom? The answer comes in verse 7 of chapter 4. Verse 7 says, the beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. And whatever you get insight. What does it take to get wisdom? It takes a desire and a decision. I think that's a really helpful way to say that. And it parallels really well with what James talks about when he says, if any of you lacks wisdom, do what? Ask God for it. It takes a desire and a decision. Just ask, and he will give it. And he will give it liberally and without reproach. Okay, so that's the idea that we're being told here. If you want wisdom, ask God for it, and you will receive it. Now, what will that do for you? This is the exaltation of wisdom part. So here we go. Verses 8 and 9, wisdom will exalt and honor the one who has it. Verses 11 and 12, wisdom will help you to have, to be led in paths of uprightness, so that your steps will not be hampered and you will not stumble. It will pave the path for success in life. Wisdom will actually give life. I love this in verse 13. Keep hold of instruction. Do not let it go. Guard her, for she is your life. What a cool phrase. Wisdom is your life. That is exactly the same phrase used in Deuteronomy 30 and verse 20 when Moses is talking about choosing life so that you will see life and know good days because you are following God, for he is your life and length of days. It's the same phrase. That if you choose God's way, you choose wisdom. If you choose wisdom, you are choosing God's way. They go together inseparably. Okay? And then verse 26, wisdom will help you to have sure footing wherever you go in life. And so Proverbs 4:26, ponder the path of your feet, and then all your ways will be sure. Steady, dependable, trustworthy. Okay? Now, here's a cool feature of this chapter. I just love it when the Bible writers do this kind of stuff. If you start in verse 20, and you go through verse 27, you get what one commentator called a spiritual medical exam. Okay? You ready for this? Here we go. Verse 20. Let me read it to you. Chapter 4, starting in verse 20. My son, be attentive to my words, incline your ear to my sayings. Let them not escape from your sight. Keep them within your heart, for they are life to those who find them and healing to all their flesh. Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. Put away from you crooked speech, and put devious talk far from you. Let your eyes look directly forward, and your gaze be straight before you. Ponder the path of your feet, and then all your ways will be sure. Do not swerve to the right or to the left. Turn your foot away from evil. And so here's the rundown of it. You have ears that are attentive to wise sayings, a heart that is keeping and pondering wisdom, a mouth that speaks truth, eyes that are alert and attentive to God's ways, and feet that walk in his paths. Let's see if I can do it. Watch your ears, your heart, your mouth, your eyes, and feet. There you go. It totally works though, doesn't it? And that's what he's doing. So he's going top to bottom, the whole of your life, everything that you take in. Be deliberate about it and make sure that it is pleasing to God. All right. Now, I had asked you a homework question, but let's see if we can make it through chapter 5. I'll skip it for just now. Okay. In chapter 5, we have one long poem on one topic here, and the whole thing is exactly what the heading says. If you're looking at an ESV printing, it is a warning against adultery. Okay. And it outlines really conveniently in this way. Number 1, verses 1 and 2, you have the wisdom and the appeal to listen to wisdom. Verses 3 through 14, you have the warning of what will happen if you don't listen to wisdom. Verses 15 through 20, you have the way that it should be done in life. And then verses 21 through 23, the why. What's the purpose? What do you gain from it? So let me just show you very quickly. Verses 1 and 2 of chapter 5 are a call to pay attention. Why was I going through that so quickly? Y'all should have told me. Anyway, you can just yell stop, and that would be okay. Anyway, verses 1 and 2. You have the call to pay attention to this because it matters so much. My son, be attentive to my wisdom, that you may keep discretion and your lips may guard knowledge. Okay. Then in verses 3 through 14, we see what happens and how bad things are when sexual immorality is part of life. And so he talks about how you will give your honor away to other people. You'll give your years and your vitality away. You'll end up old, sad, and lonely if this is the path that you choose to follow. That's kind of the picture that he's painting there. I saw a real life example of this, and I have several friends that have seen real life examples of this perfectly playing out. It's a pretty well documented and sociologically studied thing in the Caribbean that the culture does not in any way regard fatherhood as important. And so, I was staying in a hotel in Grenada. I was down there for a preaching trip several years ago, and there was a little rack of paperback books, and one of them, I pulled it out because the title on the spine caught my attention. And the title was Fathers or Breeders, the Crisis of Fatherhood in the Caribbean. And this was true all up and down the Caribbean, north to south. Almost all of those countries, regardless of what language they speak, almost all of them have this crisis where the men, they have gotten a bunch of ladies pregnant, they have kids by a ton of different women, and they are nowhere involved in those people's lives, either the women or the kids. And so what you end up with is you have nursing homes that are full of old men that are purely being kept there by the government. because they have nobody to care for them. They have nobody that they've ever given their lives to. They have no fidelity whatsoever that's been part of their lives and their relationships and their families. And so they're sad, they're bitter, they're lonely. What's that?
It's a financial.
What do you mean?
It's a long story, I'll tell you.
Oh, all right, cool. I kind of want to hear it, kind of don't. But it's anyway. It's a real life example of exactly what he's talking about here when he says, like, look at verse 9. Lest you give your honor to others and your years to the merciless, and strangers take their fill of your strength, and your labors go to the house of a foreigner. And at the end of your life you groan when your flesh and body are consumed, and you say, lamenting, how I hated discipline and my heart despised reproof. And now verse 14, I'm at the brink of utter ruin among the assembled congregation. So it's just pointing to the fact in a very raw kind of way that the fidelity that we have toward our families is the wisdom and righteousness of God. Like, that matters so much, okay? And that's why the way that he talks about is to be faithful to your wife and to receive the gift that has been given to you by God as a gift given to you by God. Be faithful to your wife and be happy with her, because verses 21 through 23, this is the way of God. Anything else leads to death. Okay? And so you have the wisdom, the warning, the way, and the why. Now, here's what I think Proverbs is doing for us. Number one, it is telling us, be faithful to your spouse. Men and women, learn the wisdom. Be faithful to your spouse. And also, it is doing both things at the same time. We have this wonderful metaphor to say when you walk away from true wisdom, your life will fall apart. Do better than that. It's like if you have by any chance ever heard stories of somebody that was unfaithful to their family and their life fell apart. Listen, walking away from God is like that. That's the technique that he's using here in chapter 5. And so that's the thing that we need to make sure and absorb and make it extremely important in the way we think about our own lives, okay? Now, I did ask you this, and so I'll do this question kind of finishing up here. In chapter 5, we're instructed to abstain from adultery and illicit sexual activity. Galatians 5, which is the fruits of the Spirit, which virtue listed there does this passage embody most completely? Anybody want to take a stab at what I was going for on that one? There it is. Self-control. If there is any demonstration of maturity and wisdom, it is a properly balanced and properly implemented understanding of self-control. So important in so many of these discussions of what is wise and what is foolish, what is right and what is wrong. So crucially important. So yeah, good reminders for all of us just to check. Are we living the kind of life that we should be? Are we living a wise kind of life versus foolish kind of life? Are we listening to the wisdom of God as he's spoken it to us? Okay, I'm done. Any other thoughts?
No fool like an old fool.
No fool like an old fool. Oh no. I don't know any, so don't have to worry about it. All right, thank you everybody. I appreciate it.